Gojo vs Sukuna is by far one of the most popular and controversial fights in battle shonen period. And despite this battle having ended what seems like forever ago, you can still find this fight being highly contested, debated, and argued amongst Jujutsu Kaisen fans on either end of the spectrum. Today I'd like to put an end to that by going over every version of Gojo vs Sukuna to cover every possible matchup that could have happened throughout the manga. This is gonna be a long one, so strap in. Now, as far as this video is concerned, Gojo's forms are far less extensive than Sukuna's. Pre-awakening teen Gojo, post-awakening teen Gojo, adult Gojo pre-prison realm, and adult Gojo post-prison realm will be the forms for Gojo discussed today. Conversely, Sukuna with 1, 2, 3, and 15 fingers of his power, his 20-finger form is Megana, and his true form both with and without World Dismantle will all be addressed. After comparing all of the core versions of Gojo and Sukuna, I'll include a few bonus matchups that involve versions of the characters that we know less about or are simply less important to deciding the outcome of this war for the title of the strongest. I'll be tallying the wins and losses of both characters as we go throughout the matchup so that by this video's end, we have a definitive answer to this fight in a holistic fashion. Pitting Gojo up against every version of Sukuna, it only makes sense that we start with his weakest shown form, starting with teen Gojo before awakening at the hands of Toji, who, in a word, has absolutely no hope of defeating any version of Sukuna we've seen on screen. From 1 finger to 20, it's quite obvious that Sukuna at any point in the story has enough physical ability and refinement in all areas of Jujutsu to beat a version of Gojo who can't heal, use red, purple, or even his own domain expansion. For starters, he has no probable win con against even the weakest form of Sukuna, as his strongest attack, maximum output blue, has no real impressive AP feats within the story. Contrast this with 3-finger Sukuna being comparable to Toji physically in Megumi's mind, and even some of the weakest forms of the character imaginable would have feats that confirm he's outpacing Gojo pretty badly. The main reason for this version of Gojo's defeat though is a lack of domain. As seen in the actual fight between Gojo versus Sukuna, the battle of domains was integral to the outcome of the fight and the evenness of it leading up to its conclusion. So with Gojo only having Falling Blossom Emotion and Simple Domain in his repertoire to counter Malevolent Shrine, it's only a matter of time before he's defeated. Simple Domain would simply be shattered as it was in the canon fight. And while the same isn't quite true for Falling Blossom Emotion, as it is just a better anti-barrier technique when fighting against Malevolent Shrine, those small cuts that were of no consequence to Gojo due to his healing would compound over time and lead to his demise. Even if without a domain, Gojo was capable of slapping Sukuna up at this point, the pinnacle of sorcery is the great equalizer and would immediately demolish the Gojo of this era. And while I'd love to say that this changes significantly post-awakening, the fact of the matter is that not too much that pertains to this battle is affected. At this point, Gojo could potentially be faster than lower forms of Sukuna, especially if you consider Toji a complete match for him in the physical department and observe Gojo's obvious speed gap with him following his RCT usage. Speaking of which, Gojo being able to use that in this fight is a good way for its length to be extended, as Falling Blossom Emotion becomes a much more viable strategy as a counter domain, so long as Gojo is able to heal the damage these slashes are incurring as they happen. Combine these extra abilities with added maneuverability, Curse Technique Reversal Red, and Purple as an ace in the hole, and you obviously have a character that is pressing Sukuna a lot more than before. The only way that this version of Gojo can win, however, is with Purple. Despite the massive spike in proficiency, we know that Red can be tanked pretty easily if Domain Amplification or some other Curse Technique Nullification tool is used, which Sukuna has at his disposal. We see this strategy not only employed by Toji in hidden inventory, but when going up against a significantly more proficient version of the character, Sukuna was quick and intelligent enough to shroud himself in domain amplification to lower the output of the attack. Considering blue is an even weaker application of the Limitless, Sukuna should be more than capable of surviving attacks from most of Gojo's arsenal, even in his weaker forms. The domain amplification strategy doesn't seem to work on curse techniques with especially high output though, and based on the difference in potency that we can see, it's very likely that Purple possesses enough stopping power to kill weaker versions of Sukuna in theory. Where things get dicey though is trying to determine whether or not this version of Gojo's Purple would be enough. Even if it landed on Sukuna in the exact same way as it did Toji, I'm not quite sure that it would be enough to kill him outright. Sukuna's reverse curse technique is extremely impressive and refined, even more so than what Gojo's should be at this point, and the fact that he can exist without a functioning heart and still be combat ready leads me to believe that damage on that scale, while significantly detrimental, wouldn't be enough to instantly simply end the fight in the way you'd want it to if you're a Gojo fan. And now an attack that lands square in his chest or directly on his head should be enough, but at this point in the story, Gojo's purple doesn't have that kind of AoE, and he still doesn't have a real answer to Sukuna's domain. Even with reverse curse technique, coming directly off the heels of learning it, we know that he hasn't automated it quite yet, and even after a year of training hasn't mastered his own domain, which still leaves a pretty obvious win con for Sukuna. Now, I'll grant high diff wins to Gojo when going up against 1 and 2 fingers of Sukuna, simply because they are the most featless versions of the character, and you could maybe argue they get slapped up in close quarters before getting one shot prior to a domain even being opened. After that though, things are too close even statistically, and Sukuna's ability to fortify himself with cursed energy in preparation for purple goes way up. 3-finger Sukuna and beyond just have too solid of a win con and countermeasure to what Gojo is at this point to genuinely argue that they lose. This all changes when talking about adult Gojo, the version of the character that we see for a majority of the series. Almost every single ability that his previous versions lacked, this Gojo has and has in spades, constantly running curse technique and RCT, nigh limitless stamina and cursed energy, likely heightened cursed energy output, and most importantly, a domain expansion. Nearly every hole or weakness that he has as a sorcerer is now sealed, and without question, it's safe to say that he slaps up Sukuna from 1 to 3 fingers without much need for a breakdown on how each individual fight plays out. We saw how Sukuna was looking after fighting Gojo for 10 seconds with only 1 finger, and while his power should increase ambiguously after that, it's certainly not enough of a gap that I'd be willing to argue the physical beatdown Gojo put on him could be countered. Ironically enough, I don't think this fight necessarily even makes it to domains either, as Sukuna up to 3 fingers story-wise doesn't have knowledge of Gojo's domain and the danger of Infinite Void's sure hit ability. While it's arguable he would immediately counter with a domain of his own anyway, it's difficult to say how well he'd respond to this on the fly, specifically with his stats potentially being much lower. Needless to say, Gojo slaps Sukuna in his earliest forms quite easily. Now, where things start getting a little bit more contentious and difficult is when we get to 15 fingers of Sukuna. And this fight, in my mind, deserves a bit more attention, if only because with this much of his form regained, certain questions about the nature of his power need to be asked and answered. For starters, what exactly does gaining another finger do for him? Within the community, there are 2 main schools of thought. The first argues that Sukuna with only 1 finger of his power is comparable in cursed energy output and manipulation to himself with 20 fingers, which would mean that his stats remain the same, with only his overall cursed energy levels being affected. I found that the most solid arguments for this interpretation predicate themselves on it simply not making sense for Sukuna to be just less proficient at using Jujutsu with 1 finger as opposed to 20. This point would then be substantiated by the fact that even with only 10% of his original power, he was able to open his domain with no trouble, and seemingly no drop in efficiency, as it possessed no visual barrier like most domains do. Now, one could simply argue that Sukuna is so powerful and skilled as a sorcerer that even with 10% of his usual proficiency with cursed energy, he'd still be capable of using Malevolent Shrine, but this point seems to be one commonly used for the aforementioned line of thinking. The second school argues that with every finger consumed, not only does his raw cursed energy increase, but his strength, speed, and durability increase alongside it as a byproduct of his output increasing. This is a theory that in my experience seems to be more consistently demonstrated, and I'll explain why. For starters, Sukuna with 1 finger absolutely could not seem to keep up with Gojo in the slightest. Well, yes, Gojo's blue enhanced speed was the reason for this. In their final fight, it's clear that Gojo's amplifying his movements with the same technique, yet Sukuna is able to track his attacks significantly better. Could this just be a result of familiarity? Perhaps, but a mere difference in physicality would also suffice as an explanation for it. Megumi's comparison of Toji and 3-finger Sukuna in Shibuya is another example of this. Despite us knowing that Sukuna in his complete form is capable of making a mockery of Toji and Maki's speed, Megumi seems quite confident that his father and Sukuna are in the same ballpark. Now, this is a statement that I've held in contention for quite a while, considering that he's getting perception blitz in both instances, but if we do argue that Megumi isn't just talking out of his ass, and is coming from this from at least a semi-informed stance, this would also lead us to the conclusion that fingers equal a direct upgrade in all abilities, at least to some extent. The only problem you may be able to bring up with this idea, aside from the fact that Megumi might not be a reliable narrator, is the fact that Sukuna was that fast with no heart. However, even while weakened with a similar injury far below his normal capacity, Sukuna was able to speed blitz Maki at one point during their fight, so this doesn't inherently disparage the feat in question. The final point in this theory's favor actually comes from Sukuna himself. When facing Mahoraga, Sukuna says that it's possible he would have lost if Megumi summoned him back then. obviously referring to his heartless 3-finger form. Yet he's clearly capable of slapping Mahoraga around with 15 fingers and is actively testing him throughout the course of their bout with no fear for his life or safety. Now, even this statement has a plethora of different interpretations that can change the meaning of his words, but Sukuna is making the point that in the past, he was lacking either in stats that can test Mahoraga or the potency of ability to eliminate him in one shot in the same way that he had before. If this is what he means, then alongside all of the other statements and information presented, it would be clear that Sukuna's combat-related abilities all rise by some unquantifiable degree with every finger increase. Add on to this fact that each finger holds an aspect of his very soul, and it's not hard to see why this interpretation is favored within the community. If you go with the former idea, however, only his stamina and longevity in a fight should be improved as we move up the list of Sukuna fingers. Now, you may be curious why I brought this up. Why does this even matter in the first place? Well, let's think about it like this. If 15-finger Sukuna and 20-finger Sukuna are the same in every regard, except one version has twice Yuta's cursed energy, while the other only has 1.5 times his energy, then even Shibuya-era Sukuna should be able to scrap with Gojo. Their control over cursed energy is relative, and their physical clashing would remain the same. However, if 15-finger Sukuna is weakened by any noticeable degree, as he's still missing a pretty decent portion of his power, he would likely be overwhelmed by the sheer difference in stats that a Gojo capable of comparing to 20-finger Sukuna would have. This falls more in line with my interpretation of Sukuna's abilities, so Gojo will advance past both 15-finger Sukuna and 15-finger Megana, but your mileage may vary depending on your interpretation or how exactly you think the acquiring of power and fingers works for Sukuna. Unfortunately for both Gojo and his fans, his hot streak must stop here, as he is then immediately met with 20-finger Megana, who wins for reasons that seem quite apparent. A version of himself more properly suited for this battle lost, and while I don't think the 10 Shadows would even be a necessity in this fight due to Gojo's one glaring flaw, it's more fitting to address that when discussing this next matchup, so I'll save it for a bit. Speaking of which, Gojo versus True Form Sukuna with no World Slash is the next fight on the card. 4 arms, an extra mouth, and Kamutoke. You know, the works. And it's with this fight specifically that I know we're finally reaching the versus battles that touch on the questions that so many fans have. Was Sukuna carried by the 10 Shadows? And just like most questions worth putting forward, the answer is rather complicated. In their battle, as it was shown, was Sukuna relying heavily on the 10 Shadows and Mahoraga specifically to defeat Gojo? Of course. Even the staunchest Sukuna defender would not and should not deny that. However, especially against this version of Gojo, there were and are other strategies Sukuna could have employed, specifically when talking about going down the domain route. You see, pre-Prison Realm Gojo simply shouldn't have the ability to shrink his barrier, at least not in the same way he was capable of in Shinjuku. The reason for this is given in chapter 228. As stated by Kusakabe, even for the most powerful and skilled sorcerers, shrinking a barrier to the degree that Gojo did should be impossible, as the ability to imagine being entrapped in such a small space, yet still capable of combat wouldn't normally work. However, his experience with the prison realm should have been the perfect learning tool for Gojo to overcome this imaginative roadblock. This means that Sukuna will have the monopoly on domain clashes. Without consequence, Sukuna can and will open a domain at any moment, clash with Gojo, and assuredly win every single time. The best thing Gojo could do is flip the internal and external conditions of the barrier, which a version of Sukuna fully incarnated in the present would be able to counter as he did in the manga. This puts Gojo and the video itself at a crossroads. Gojo can either continuously expand his domain in the hopes of dragging this fight into the mud and exhausting Sukuna, in part as a tactical decision, and also as a point of pride as the strongest, or he can choose to retreat from domain battles entirely in the hopes of trying a different strategy, possibly one that relies on the overwhelming power of Hollow Purple. Unfortunately for me, there is no set precedent for a scenario like this, so I have to lay out both possible paths, as well as at the end, making a judgment call. In scenario A, where they just keep clashing, Gojo will eventually fry his brain in an attempt to outdo Sukuna and die. It really doesn't get more complicated than that. As far as we know, he has no way aside from barrier shrinking to counter Sukuna properly, and the consequences of healing his technique too much would eventually catch up to him and cause his output to plummet. Scenario B is a lot tougher though, because it basically becomes a stalemate. Without the ability for his slashes to hit Gojo, Sukuna would be forced to don the aura of domain amplification for a majority of their fight, allowing close quarters combat to be viable, but also completely lowering his lethality in any given encounter. Contrasting that, Gojo would once again only have one card up his sleeve that could even stand a chance of working. His physical attacks, Blue Orbs, and Curse Technique Reversal don't have a snowball's chance in hell of putting Sukuna down perfectly. It won't tickle him, but it sure as hell ain't doing any real damage to a character character who at this point should have his RCT completely intact, and as we've seen in this story, has pretty much eaten all of those abilities without really losing a step. This once again just leaves purple on the table, which just isn't something that I think Sukuna is allowing Gojo to get off scot-free. In the canon, Sukuna is playing much more passively in the shadows to remain safe and allow Mahoraga to adapt, but with the abilities he has at his disposal now, the safest way to avoid purple would simply be to press Gojo as much as possible. Let's just say that Gojo is somehow able to get off an unlimited holo purple despite all of that. Sukuna should be able to regenerate from this damage without the benefit of the full incarnation. The reason for this is quite simple. His brain would be intact because he was never forced to heal his technique. Once again, things are kind of just in limbo with Gojo's one confirmed ace in the hole not finishing the job, as it wasn't able to finish it on a much weaker Sukuna. And as impressive as Gojo was for pulling off a purple like this, the element of surprise was absolutely crucial to catching Sukuna in its blast radius, and without that, I don't really see a win con for Gojo existing. For this reason, alongside me just thinking it's more in character for Gojo to challenge Sukuna with their respective ultimate moves, I'd say that Gojo would inevitably continue clashing domains with Sukuna and losing, and obviously the same thing would ring true for this version of Sukuna with the World Slash. Now, one thing I will make clear before moving on to Gojo's final form is that Heian era Sukuna specifically would have more trouble fighting Gojo than the fully incarnated modern version I previously discussed, despite having equal abilities all around. The reason for this is rather basic. He just doesn't have knowledge of Gojo's techniques. The Limitless as a whole, but more specifically Infinity, Purple, and Infinite Void, being a complete unknown to him, would vastly handicap his response time and planning that he benefited from in the mainline story. So while the domain clashing strategy is still present in theory, in execution, more things could actually go wrong, as a lot of the variables that Sukuna knows about in the canon wouldn't exist here. If Gojo flipped his barrier, a Sukuna with no knowledge on how Infinite Void works wouldn't be able to turn off his sure hit technique inside of it, which was extremely important to ripping apart Infinite Void so quickly. His lack of knowledge would also make purple an even more lethal attack, as Sukuna, even when on guard, was caught in its radius twice due to the craftiness of Gojo. Without being explicitly on guard for the technique, it's very likely that he's caught unaware by the Swiss Army knife of a sorcerer that is Satoru Gojo. While not an assured victory for him by any means, it's one that's much more likely than not, so I'll add it to his tally. This just leaves Gojo's final form. Post-training, post-prison realm, post-Toji Fit Rip Gojo versus the many different versions of Sukuna. Just like his prior adult form, Gojo tears through every version of Sukuna without question until reaching 20 Finger Megana. He loses here for the same reason he lost on the canon story, leaving the matchup that I know will be the most controversial in this video. True form Sukuna versus post-prison realm Gojo. The question that shrouded the outcome in many people's minds comes up yet again. Could Sukuna have done it without the 10 shadows, specifically against the version of Gojo that was more well equipped to fight him? In order to answer this, we gotta look at all the facts and lay them out. Having Mahoraga allowed Sukuna to pursue a very specific outcome in the hopes of not only cutting Gojo down, but also making himself stronger. Without the ability of adaptation in his arsenal, Sukuna is bound to fight much differently than how we see him do in the main story. Gojo at this point has the barrier shrinking ability that is necessary to counter Sukuna's domain. The only real way for Sukuna to get a victory is through domain clashing, as is basically the same for Gojo. While Purple has the potency to take Sukuna down, unless his brain is fried, he should be able to heal from it, which basically means that it's Infinite Void versus Malevolent Shrine, domain versus domain, the strongest using their strongest abilities. And knowing all of these things, while it is tough and there are certainly other interpretations, I think it's fair to say that Sukuna wins. The reason for this? Well, without focusing on Mahoraga, he's simply less likely to lose in a domain battle to Gojo. Keep in mind, while tightening the coordinates of the barrier does make it stronger, it doesn't make it invincible. Sukuna can and will cut through it if given enough time, and I'd argue that true form Sukuna has all of the physical tools and intelligence to do so. We know that in the canon story, Sukuna and Gojo are so evenly matched that the destruction of their domain keeps happening simultaneously. Gojo's barrier falls apart because it takes about 3 minutes of continuous attacking to shred the domain, and Sukuna's because it takes about 3 minutes of continuous pressure from Gojo to damage Sukuna enough for Shrine to fall. If they're so even that their domains in the canon storyline break at the same time, why do you think that giving Sukuna 2 extra arms, a curse tool, and domain amplification wouldn't give Sukuna the extra time required to shatter Gojo's domain and finish things? Remember, Sukuna was having Mahoraga adapt to Gojo's domain behind the scenes, which meant that domain amplification couldn't be used for multiple of the clashes that they had. Domain amplification, when in the hands of Sukuna specifically, allows him to fight much more evenly with Gojo and weakens the output of most of his arsenal. Pair that with 2 extra limbs that make close quarters combat almost cheating, and there is no way that they would end up breaking their barriers at the same time. Gojo's domain would break from the slashes first, allowing Sukuna to pour on the punishment until Gojo heals his technique and approaches again. Now, I'm not saying Forearm Sukuna is a better fighter up close than Gojo. There really is not enough evidence to substantiate a claim like that. I'm only positing that the extra limbs, size, and familiarity with his own body would allow him to add even an extra second of delay, and that 1 second is all he would need, as the two were exactly in sync and a match for each other in the canon. Due to the aforementioned reasons, Gojo would at least have to have opened his domain 3 to 4 times and healed his technique 2 or 3 times in comparison to Sukuna's 1 domain expansion and no technique healing. This wouldn't be enough to fry his brain completely, sure, but we do know that the consequences of his brain damage would show up eventually. I noticed that a lot of JJK fans associate this brain damage with no domain, but that's only because Gojo and Sukuna took it to such a far extent. The real underlying issue is that messing with your brain in the way that they did will catch up to you and lower your output and curse energy efficiency. It's why, until hitting Black Flashes, that Gojo and Sukuna's reverse curse technique was so slow, as well as their curse technique's output in general being lower. Sukuna knows this. Gojo doesn't, or won't until the consequences of it catch up with him. So even if you think that Gojo would stop clashing with Sukuna upon realizing its futility, it would simply come to a point where Sukuna's domain internally should be stronger than Gojo's domain internally, as his output would plummet and so would his own control over his abilities. Because of how exactly even they are, any tipping of the scales, no matter how slight, would be enough to turn the tables completely. And once again, Sukuna's better knowledge of the brain and how it connects to sorcery would be the deciding factor in this fight. Even if Gojo would run from a domain battle usually, all Sukuna has to do is close his barrier as he intended at one point in the story and clash with Gojo on even footing as he waits for Gojo's own actions to catch up with him. Either that or Gojo, as the strongest, would continuously throw his ultimate move at Sukuna's in the hopes of finding some loophole or strategy to overcome him, ignorant of how much he's really damaging himself over the course of this entire fight. As weird as this may sound to some, I actually think defeating Gojo is simpler for Sukuna without Mahoraga, because the strategy necessary to beat Gojo and evolve as a sorcerer is more elaborate and difficult than one that prioritizes itself on merely beating Gojo by any means. To make my point a bit simpler, I'll say this. Sukuna absolutely needed Mahoraga in his fight with Gojo. Not because he wouldn't normally be strong enough to face him, but because his goal wasn't limited to a sure victory. Mahoraga was necessary for Sukuna to beat Gojo and grow significantly stronger with the development of a world dismantle, but it wasn't necessary for the task of defeating him in isolation. Now, this isn't to disparage Gojo, it's merely an observation based on everything we've seen from a narrative and power scaling perspective. Sukuna was truly only impressed by Gojo's abilities in the second half of the fight, well after they had finished fighting with their domains, and with the given context and hindsight, I think that's largely in part because on that level, Sukuna had already established himself as superior. This narrative argument is even supported by Gojo. As he himself said, it's possible that Sukuna could have defeated him even without Megumi's technique being in play, and for the reasons I've laid out for the last several minutes, I myself would agree. If you want to say that Sukuna was carried by anything, say that he's carried by knowledge and better prep time, because while Mahoraga was especially useful, it wasn't the only way he could have won, whereas, as I'll mention in a little bit, I do think that without the proper knowledge on Gojo's technique, as well as knowledge on how healing the brain affects it, Sukuna would have been in a lot more hot water. Now, World Dismantle Sukuna would obviously have an easier time against Gojo, as he's now capable of sending out slashes outside of a domain that affect him, but it really only has a tangible impact on the battle if there is no knowledge on Gojo's end on what exactly it does. With knowledge on the technique, Gojo should be able to avoid it or stop Sukuna from charging up the cursed energy, forming the hand signs, or completing the chant, as we've seen many of his students and comrades do with Sukuna before. Even without this relatively simple win con though, for the aforementioned reasons, this version of Sukuna should walk away victorious. Heian era Sukuna, however, once again, would find his lack of preparation against Gojo a problem and only add to Satoru's wins. Like I said, the knowledge being a pretty big buff to how Sukuna fights. With this match concluded though, that makes 34 total battles fought, with 14 of them going to Gojo and 20 to Sukuna. Now there are some very niche versions of the characters that I mentioned I would talk about earlier, like Kid Gojo we see very briefly in flashbacks, Volume 0 Gojo who seems to be much less overpowering as an individual sorcerer, or even true form nerfed Sukuna that we've seen fight in Shinjuku for the past year or so. Now, Kid Gojo versus Sukuna, while a funny visual, doesn't quite make for the best fight discussion, and honestly, the same goes for many different variations of weakened Sukuna we've seen throughout this arc, which is the main reason I didn't include them in the core of the video. The one thing I do want to quickly mention though, is that despite being adult and arguably being capable of all of the things that Gojo is in the mainline story, there are some statements that come from Volume 0 that imply he is much weaker in the one-shot than how he ended up being in the main story. Geto saying that having Rika in his possession would almost guarantee him victory over all of Jujutsu Society, which obviously includes Gojo, as well as Gojo himself saying that he'd be willing to put his life on the line in order to stop a rampaging Rika, definitely paints a less dominant picture of the character that we see now. Despite all of this, these depictions of each fighter aren't as important to the point of this video, so they'll be left off the main tally, but I did think that it would be appropriate, or funny at least, to mention them in a video that is literally called Every Version of Gojo versus Sukuna. Now, the gap in wins may make it seem like I'm pretty heavily biased in Sukuna's favor, and while I do think that Sukuna is stronger when comparing their peaks, if I'm being completely honest, this disparity almost solely comes from the fact that Gojo's first two forms are handicapped by their lack of domain, because without those versions of the character padding out wins for Sukuna, the final tally swings much more in Gojo's favor. For all those curious, when not accounting for teen versions of Gojo, the total fights amount to 18, with Sukuna winning 6, and Gojo winning 12, if that's any consolation for all the Gojo fans out there. In any case, that is every version of Gojo versus Sukuna. Hopefully, this is a video that can stand the test of time and act as a definitive answer to this battle in every way imaginable. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.